Welcome to Working Wisdom with Dr. Kevin Sansberry, the show where we distill the invaluable lessons learned on our mission to detoxify workplaces. In this show, we don't just explore theories, we engage in thought-provoking conversations with experts and influential leaders. Together, we'll unearth the strategies, practices, and wisdom that can elevate you and positively impact your organization. Get ready to gain actionable insights from the very best in the field. Here's your host, Dr. Kevin Sansberry.
Welcome. Dr. Kevin Sansberry here. Today's conversation is going to be about trust erosion and examining distrust in organizations. As I think about that concept, I kind of want to take it a few different ways today because there are behaviors that people do at the interpersonal level alongside, systemic mistrust and things that happen there. And so really excited. We got a guest today that I really enjoy talking with, Dan Roth, who I'll introduce in a second. But really excited to talk to Dan because one of the ways that, Dan and I's conversations typically progress is, counteracting these norms that we view as normal, I guess I would say. And so I like having somebody like Dan on because it's like talking with family. So let's invite Dan to the call. Dan, what's up, man?
What is going on, Dr. Kevin Sansberry? Looking handsome as usual. I always come on the show thinking that I'm a decent looking human being, and I leave thinking that, I'm a butterface. So we're all good.
Nah. It's good to talk to you, man. It's good to talk to you. So happy to see you again. Happy New Year to you. Why don't you take a second to introduce yourself to the listeners and viewers on the show?
Well, first of all, thank you again for having me on. It's been a hot minute since I have done a podcast, done a show, and I'm so grateful that in the new year I'm starting with you. But for those that don't know who I am, my name is Dan Roth. I do a lot. I guess I'll start off by saying that I'm a twin girl dad, an autism dad, but I have my own consulting firm. I am a professional speaker, specifically in the humanities space. Previously, I was a senior program manager and technical recruiter for one of the largest companies in the world, focused on creating sustainable long-term solutions that help narrow the gender and racial wealth gap, help promote inclusivity, so on and so forth. So there's a lot to what I do. It's because of necessity, because I've had to.
Yeah.
But these types of conversations is really my bread and butter and where I sit.
Yeah. So, as I looked at guests for this coming year and this season of the show, you were interested in the trust erosion. Why was that like topic? Why'd that speak to you?
Honestly, I would have been happy with any conversation that we had.
Yeah.
But trust erosion is an interesting thing because there's two things. One is I don't trust very easily, and that comes from upbringing. So growing up, I'm already ingrained through my nurture not to trust. But then when I look at it from a decolonization standpoint, I look at the idea of, well, I look like the type of person that's created distrust within the country, within this global society. So how can I look at organizational distrust and work to bridge the gap to hopefully correct that infrastructure and allow for more natural, organic, and meaningful and sustainable trust to occur? So there's a lot to it, and it's reflected not just in the work, but in how you operate as an individual on a very human level. And what I always say is everything starts from at home. So this isn't something that you can pick up 10 years or 20 years down the line. The real way that we have to build that trust is from the second our kids are born. We need to build it from there. And that's you have to be very conscious about that.
Absolutely. And why is it important to acknowledge decolonization as you did, as we think about trust, especially in the organizational context?
Because white people don't know who they are. It's just it's just a reality of it, because if we look at the context from that global perspective, there is an understanding. If you come from Africa, if you come from Nigeria, Showadada, if you come from South Africa, if you come from Cameroon, if you come from India, there's a very strong understanding of exactly who you are, where your ethnic background comes from, and what those historical traditions are. Being white, there's a lack of sensibility on, well, where do I come from, where do I organically sprout. So the decolonization is having that understanding of, hey, I need to go back to ground zero and really figure out who I am in order for me to understand how this all comes into play, and how I can build trust in a way that really looks at it from the perspective of race is a social construct. So if I take it back from that level, then what I'm trying to do in essence is say, well, if you're from Cameroon and you know exactly who you are, and you're from New Zealand and you are, well, now I want to be on that same level where I know exactly who I am so that I can build, because you can't build from a place where you don't know.
So let's play that out. So the antecedent of a behavior, meaning the thing that happens before the behavior, I don't know who I am. What do you see? So I don't know who I am. I have no idea, right? What do you see as the behavior that manifests at work? Like, how does that show up at work from a behavior standpoint?
So,
or how could it, I guess?
Well, no, it's an interesting question, because I think that you have to look at it from different perspectives. And if you're looking at it from somebody that looks like me, it manifests itself in terms of privilege. When we don't acknowledge what our privilege is, then we have no way of understanding how to operate within a group dynamic. So things like microaggressions, things like gaslighting, a lot of these things are done, one, because people are just bad people, but more specifically because growing up with that privilege, there's a lack of understanding of what should be done, I guess, what is and what is not appropriate. My brain's going in about 12,000 different directions, so I'm trying to build clarity. So if I mix up my words a little bit, my apologies.
It's all good. No, it's all good. No, I think like one of the things I think about when you consider that concept of microaggressions and or gaslighting, it's really important to lift up, because those two aspects of work life are often invisible for people who don't experience it. And often, if you have like some kind of power in the organization and or privilege from a social demographic construct, the only way you know about it is somebody self-reported, and or you look at like qualitative survey data, which is also self-report. But oftentimes it's hard for people to like grasp it because they never experienced it before. And I find that challenging at times as it relates to this work.
Well, the problem is the trust erosion begins before somebody ever steps foot in corporate. Because if we look
absolutely.
I mean, just bringing this full circle, if we look at just the way that the interview process plays out, there's barriers of entry focused on education levels that automatically maintains or increases the gender and racial wealth gap. If we look at the fact that most interview panels do not have representation, which is a completely heavy and interesting topic because of its sensitivity. If we look at the fact that most people of color are coming into teams where they know they're going to be the only one that looks like them on that team, these are all factors that go into the trust erosion, because I think when you call it trust erosion, there's this assumption that there's trust to begin with. But if we look at people like Dr. Post-traumatic slave disorder, my brain is not functioning today.
It's all good. It's all good.
Let me this is going to bother me. And like, I'm such a big fan of her work. Yes, Dr. Joy DeGruy. So if we look at people that like Dr. Joy DeGruy, who talk about, well, generational trauma creates manifestations in current life,
Mhm.
then from that perspective, there was no trust to begin with, because again, generation after generation, that it's been ingrained that you can't trust.
Yeah.
So true trust erosion didn't just start now. It
Yep.
started hundreds, if not thousands of years ago.
Yep. And that's where I was going to go next, because I think beyond, I agree with you, beyond what an organization does or doesn't do with a hiring panel, people are walking in there with mistrust anyway. And I think that kind of tells us the magnitude. And when I look at things like, I know a lot of people do, what's that guy's name? That guy, Five Dysfunctions of a Team, and I forget the name, but like
No
people
idea.
center. Yeah, I have no idea. People center that word. Covey, is it Covey? I don't know who it is, but Lencioni. I think it's Lencioni. Pat Lencioni. Five Dysfunctions of a Team. It's great. It makes, it passes the smell test, right? Building trust is at the bottom of it as a foundation, and what that implies a lot of times is that we all have the same path to trusting from a systemic standpoint. And I tell people, like, no, we don't. The path is a lot longer for me. I don't trust up front. I start off with, and that's based off of, not only again past experience, but also my eyes are open and things I've learned from elders and things I've been taught from elders as relates to safety. And so I think like we have to take a very different approach to trust, because a lot of times we just assume it's like a given, if that makes sense.
See, what's interesting about that is growing up with ADHD and language processing disorder. So when people hear me talk and I'm either really lengthy or don't appear to know what I'm saying, it's because I have a disorder that I know what I'm trying to say up here, but it doesn't always go come correctly out my mouth. And the reason I'm saying this is I was bullied from a very, very young age. So from a nurture standpoint, um, that lack of trust was ingrained in me at a very early structural point. And
Mm,
that, so by the time that I got into corporate, because let's make these, I'm not going to make the assumption everybody goes to college, because let's stop making that assumption.
yeah.
Well, let's make the assumption high school, for better or worse. You're already talking about uh, I'm going through 12 years of education before I get into a workforce, and that distrust has been built over time. And the fact of the matter is, these types of mental health, because I am going to call it mental health, uh,
Yeah.
trust is a strong component of mental health. But the fact of the matter is that mental health, as we've seen time and time again in the news and in our school systems, trust is not something that, and mental health is not something that is granted to you. It's something that, as a parent, as an individual, you're almost left to your own device to figure out, okay, well, I need to do this for my mental health. And there's not even an acknowledgement of resources to help or things to do. Like I developed an eating disorder that I still have to this day at age 12. I never knew that men could have eating disorders. I have body dysmorphia. I was never told that men could have body dysmorphia. So these things that when it comes to mental health, you're never told. And then it's like, well, who can I trust? Who do I trust? Growing up in the 90s, a lot of the things we talk about, like locker room behavior, well, I don't jive with that. So if where does it come from? And that's coming from somebody that grew up as a privileged white kid. Take that same thing and add this to a double, a triple, a quad minority, and respectfully, no wonder the rates of, I don't want to touch on that subject, are so high. We do not live in a society built to generate trust. We live in a society that is losing trust day by day.
Yeah. And part of it, I will say, is we've had conversations before about meritocracy, and that false notion of like, everything's fair, when just what you just lifted up was an exact example of or a direct example of different paths and how things may be more difficult for individuals with ADHD, for example. One of the comments in the chat indicated, I put it up there earlier, it's up to parents to be aware and break generational trauma, from Sharon Hope, and I totally agree with that.
How
As a
can
notion
you
of
though?
like, well, I guess I can't say it's up to parents, but I think
Well, no,
parents
no, no,
play a
no, no, no.
role. But
My
yeah,
point is, if parents weren't
but
educated
how can they? Yeah,
by their parents,
you're right.
then how do you want? I mean, this goes back to the entire system of distrust and system of inequality, in the sense that who's supposed to start the cycle
Yeah.
of building trust and education
Hmm.
if nobody before has done that?
Correct. 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 And I think part of, as we think about who's the start, right? I think there are a lot of systems that may play a role, but back to our own mental well-being and mental health, you got to be, we also have to play a role in that too. But it is much harder for individuals based off of their whatever circumstances they're facing and things like that. It's a hard. I mean, there's no one right way. There's no one right answer, and I think it is something that's very, yeah. There's a lot of factors there.
Well, it's one of the reasons that people take such pride when they're the first member of their family to go to college,
Go to
when
college.
they're the
Yep.
first member to break through. It's because it takes a special individual and a special person to be able to look at a structure and act outside of expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that
Mm-hmm.
criticality of being able to do that we have to almost rely on. And it's sad. It's extremely sad, because we were supposed to, like, if we look at life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, like, if that's the way it was supposed to be to start, nobody told anybody, because that doesn't appear to be the ground that we stand on.
Mm-hmm.
The way that
Mm-hmm.
appears, the ground that we tend to stand on right now, is we're standing deep in the waters of a drowned town. We're halfway up, and we're having to claw and pull our way out so that we can then drain that water and bring back what we rightfully should have all along.
Yes. And at the same time, it appears that we're operating with band-aid fixes and, false hope and promises that, aren't going to come into fruition. And unfortunately, once the higher you go, the more lonely you are in a lot of ways. Whereas,
Sorry about that.
it's okay. Let's say you coming from a place of privilege. The higher you go, you might be with people more like you, and so it's like the complete opposite, at times. I remember when I became a VP, in some roles, and in consulting, became, been in closed door sessions with C-suites and stuff like that. I'm like the only one here with certain perspectives, and I found that quite interesting sometimes. And imagine, so then we talk about trust, how hard I didn't like, my trust didn't increase, I'm gonna say. And so I think we have to be able to look at the systems that we have in place. You talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The systems that we have in place are not congruent with that, for people.
No, they're not. And by the way, everybody, my phone is off. My wife is the only one that can reach out, and she has a habit of doing that. Yeah. What's really sad to me is that the higher people go in the C-suite, especially when, and this is my experience, so let me just be clear, especially people of color, the less change that they're able to make. To me, tokenism is most present at the top. So it's extremely lonely. Even, I hate the term piggybacking, but piggybacking off of what you said, because the way that I see the corporate structure is that you have the people right on the surface level that are working to make a difference, and they may make some sort of shift, some sort of difference. But then if their bosses don't buy in, then they go nowhere. And then maybe 2 levels above, then there's this other, sort of director level role where they can start to build some of these things, and they're given a little bit more leeway by the C-suite that's in charge. But then you get to the point 3 stages higher, and now we're talking about, the CEO and the CEO's team, where you inherently have that token representation. They're in this role, they're making an incredible amount of money, but they're not able to make a difference because they're being choked. And I'm very purposely using that word, choked, at that point. And what's really difficult is when you get to that point, and I can't imagine this because I don't have the lived experience, either as a person from a marginalized community or otherwise, but when you get to that point, I have to imagine how difficult it is, because you have options. Your option is, do I stay in this job and create generational wealth for my family, knowing that my kids and my grandkids are going to be better off, but not actually be able to do anything to change the system? Or do I let go of that wealth, sit on my, work within my ethical and moral sensibilities, but then have to go somewhere else and start from scratch? Or
Right.
even entrepreneurial life is not easy. So everybody's talking about let's go be an entrepreneur. So you get to that point, you're like, okay, well, I don't want to work for them for Whitey anymore. Let me go create this. But now you're dealing with this. You struggled so much to get to this point in corporate, and now you're facing almost the same, if not worse, struggle as an entrepreneur just to build it up.
Without the corporate backing, right? Exactly. And you get into those positions and you're feeling alone, that isolation, the pressure internally, to you got kids at home, you got whatever those things are, right? The generational wealth and those pieces. Some folks, whether consciously or implicitly, make decision based on behaviors that they do to fall in line with the inherent oppression that gets perpetuated through many different systems, whether we're talking about educational institutions, whether we're talking about housing, whatever it may be. And on top of the hierarchy that you have, that you just described, you slap this not new system, this other system on top of it called DEI. And we're solely, when we look at when we get into DEI, look, we're gonna go there. I'm going there. I'm sorry.
If you're going there, you know what's going to happen, right?
I know.
Okay.
I'm going there.
Okay.
So you slap that on top of it, and inherently we're solely focused on optical things, the diversity. We're solely focused on the optical.
Well,
we're doing nothing.
Not to interrupt, but you could call it what it is that you were going to.
Yeah.
Optical illusion. That
It's
illusion is that key word.
Yeah. It's an illusion. And it's cultural theater. It becomes cultural theater where we got all the right stuff. We got all the stuff on the website. We look like the United Nations, in these stock photos that we use, but we do nothing or little related to inclusion and equity. And that's been harmful for years, decades even.
I have to tell you that recently I've struggled with the equity standpoint. And I'll tell you the reason for my struggle. I do firmly believe in fair and equal pay. One of the things that I've been thinking about, though, when we look at is inflation. And when we look at somebody that gets hired 3 years ago, when prices are at a certain point,
and then you get wage compression.
And then years later, somebody else is getting hired for the same position, $50,000-$60,000 more. And it's something I hadn't considered 3 years ago, but now I'm looking at it and trying to figure out, and this is not a question I have an answer to, but it's something I'm trying to figure out. Well, how does this play in to the gender and racial wealth gap? And are there measures that could be put in place that are corrective, with the understanding that we may not have a full understanding of where society is going and financials are going in the future? So how do we create a level playing field when there's so much uncertainty? Now, going back to the DEI standpoint, you're a lot more sly than I give you credit for. Because so the reason I'm saying this, everyone, is because I was one of those DEI practitioners that was let go from big tech in the last couple of years. And I was one of those ones that was creating sustainable programs and creating systems of guaranteeing representation. But I want to be very careful in saying that it wasn't just me. It was a large team of people. I don't want to go about column bussing this idea. As I sit and as I look at it now, the only roles that are out there are DEI directors, because everybody else has been fired. And I'll also say that in the very beginning, after George Floyd, I was one of those hopefuls that thought, hey, things are finally going to change. But it was a very quick realization that DEI was a PR stunt. And worse than that is that while DEI did not start off as being this way, it became anti-Black, and it became a weaponization of the 2%. I don't know exactly how. It's something I struggle with, but something that was so ingrained in equality, those people in charge figured out a way to shape it and mold it to what they wanted it to be. And initially I was reticent to call it humanity work, but I have a very close friend, Sharon, Sharon and John Graham Jr., and we were talking about it, and they were like, okay, well, yeah, it really is humanity work. We can't call it diversity, equity, inclusion, because it doesn't have to do with that anymore. I'm going to have to turn over to you to lead the conversation, because I have so many thoughts. It's like, I don't know exactly where to go with it.
No, that notion of humanity is something that a lot of practitioners have kind of came to, including myself, because I had to go back to think about, as I looked at DEI as like an infrastructure, what was like the point from my perspective. And my perspective was, I wanted individuals who experienced similar hardships as I did, based off of my demographics and stuff like that. I wanted to experience my full humanity, just like you. I don't want a job handed to me. I don't want like an easier path. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I want it to be a meritocracy, to be honest. Like, give me a meritocracy. But in order to get a meritocracy, we have to have catch-ups, because there's been catch-ups from the past. Like, there are a lot of inequities that like my grandparents, great-grandparents, and I have like my family tree now up to like 1800s, so like I know like a lot. For example, so let's talk about meritocracy. Okay, well, my 7th great-grandfather was sold by in Georgetown University. That sale of the slaves, one of my grandfathers was part of that, and got sold to Louisiana to keep Georgetown University open. And I discovered that as it relates to my family tree. So, okay, what if my 7th great-grandfather was a mathematical like prodigy or what have you? How was that fair? If we talking meritocracy, right? And so people say, oh, you can't have the 200-year, 300-year conversation and talk about but think about the cascading impact of the inequality. And so I'm just saying that to say one thing: it's not a true meritocracy until we can say there's an equal playing field. Sure, I went to college. Sure, doctorates, MBAs, all that kind of stuff. I've done all the things you're supposed to do, but yet I get into the vice president role and feel like I have less power than the other vice presidents. Why is that?
You have to drive
You know,
60 miles an hour to go 30 miles on a road with no traffic.
that is correct. That is correct. And so we have to look at like how we're applying, when we talk about organizational culture, we have to look at why we're looking at that and how we're looking at that, not only from a race standpoint, but also gender differences impact on gender and neurodiversity as well. I mean, among other things, there's all kind of other aspects we can look at it, but I'm just want to name a few. And I think we take the easy way out, and DEI being a PR stunt was the most profitable thing to do post George Floyd until they didn't have to. And the easy way out now is, as you know, they're cutting and laying off and stuff like that. Yeah, and it's a shame.
Yeah. And, I told you this before, but I'm coming angry today because one of my dear friends was let go from a senior DEI position just in the last 24 hours. And it's bad enough for companies to not believe in what they're doing. It's another thing for them to play with people's lives. And playing is what they're doing. The humanity is not being taken into consideration. So how do we live in a society that does not have that consideration for the human being? And that's a big question. And I want to pivot a little bit because something came up in the last week, and it's an interesting take on all of this. So I mentioned entrepreneurship before. So I'm not going to name names, but I work with a lot of clients that are in the diversity space, or I work with minority owned businesses. And recently I was doing an audit of this company, and primarily most of the employees were Black. They had one white individual that worked for them. And the individual came to me, he's like, I have a question for you. He goes, I'm really proud to work for a Black female owned business. And I've heard the owner's spouse say that in talking with clients. Am I allowed to put it in my byline? Am I allowed to put it in my email signature? And he was coming at it from a place of genuine curiosity and pride in the fact that he was working for an individual that is a minority, that is female, that is creating generational wealth. And I had to go back and talk with the owner about it. And it's a valid question because on one hand, you always want to take pride in the employer. You always want to take pride in who you're working for and the honor of who's involved, especially when it's deserved. But on the other hand, it goes to show what our society has devalued, because from this framework, what benefit would it play for this person to do this? Does it make the services that are being rendered any more or less valuable? And the reason that this really is such a big deal is because the answer to those questions is no. The answer to those questions is that this individual did this because they're this founder of this company did this because they are a bad donkey person who scraped and clawed harder than everyone else to build this business. At the same standpoint, would it benefit the business to utilize the tokenization of this labeling to improve business? And I'll tell you straight up, it would, because a lot of people, a lot of companies do want to hire for minority-owned businesses. But again, we have to ask ourselves, are we doing it from a tokenization standpoint, or are we doing it because they are the best ones to do the job? And the reason I'm bringing this up is because these are the types of questions that have come up since George Floyd. But the fact that it's coming up 5 years later shows a gross misunderstanding of the entire point of what happened to begin with.
Correct. That is correct.
Yeah.
Keep going. No, keep going.
No, I just bring it up as an example because I feel like it's very pertinent to the conversation. And these are the conversations that people are happening, because if you do have minority-owned businesses, not every minority-owned business is run by Robert Johnson. So,
Right.
like, how do we create this distinction amongst brand building? And, you know, going back to Sharon's original comment, what would have happened if this person's parents had educated them a little bit better?
Yeah.
On what if they were asked, what if they were taught to ask the right questions? Because, and I'll say this as in a finality, I have no problem with this person asking the question because it came from a genuine place of curiosity and care. It was out of looking for education as opposed to tokenization. So I have to give this person credit because I'd rather them ask the question than do it and then be like, so yeah.
And that is a really really important question to consider when we talk about, you know, trust and stuff. Is like when individuals are wanting to be an ally, how can I be an ally without engaging in forms of tokenization? You know, that comes up a lot in consulting and coaching that I do as well. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's important to, you know, one question I tell people to ask is, whose comfort are you centering? Are you doing this for yourself? Who are you doing this for? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like really delve into like, why are you doing the behavior? Why is that even coming to mind? Because a lot of times folks want to like be like the look at me, and you're really building your own platform, and you're really not engaging in allyship. You're taking the mic, you know. And so I think that's one small way, one small thing one can do as we think about that line.
And there are questions that, so, you know, we always talk about in the community, you know, we are not your Google, but there are some questions that do need to be answered by an individual, and this is certainly one of them. But you just touched on another thing that drives me nuts, and that's that term ally. I think this is probably the point where even when I'm professionally speaking, one of my most requested keynotes, the focus is the difference between allyship and being an accomplice, a co-conspirator. And by the way, I was given the term accomplice by a community member. It wasn't something I gave myself. And for those that aren't familiar with what the differences are, an ally is somebody that believes something is wrong and will put their arm across your shoulder. An accomplice will look at why an action occurred, the systems of oppression, the structures that created it, and put themselves at risk by going to change those structures of oppression. You could call it in a similar vein an abolitionist, although there's fundamental differences between them, and a co-conspirator. So when we talk about allyship, I don't like ally. This is going to sound mean. Everybody that wants change from a Caucasian perspective does have to start as an ally. I don't believe that there's a linear path that skips a step, but go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and that is why I use the word allyship, because that what you just described wasn't accomplished, you know, being an accomplice or a co-conspirator at all. You know, that is typically where people start is, can I post it on my signature? Can I post something on LinkedIn? That's, you know, that's how you described it. And yeah, I would in no way put that at the accomplice level or co-conspirator. So I just wanted to make that note.
The problem is that 98% of allies never become accomplices.
That is correct. And that is correct.
I mean, and this is where my biggest issue comes into play, because it's a representation of society. When you stay as an ally, you're sitting within your comfort. Correct. And I aside from wanting a comfortable toilet, maybe with a heater, I don't like sitting in my comfort. There's not a day that goes by that I don't want to challenge myself, that I don't think about the fact that being white, I was born with privilege, being white, that I was born with biases, and that every day I have to analyze and look at what I am doing and seeing, well, could I have done something a little bit better? Could I have approached this or used different linguistics? What is the current terminology that's being used to ensure that we're being inclusive? Perfect example. And this, if you have any like stout Christians in the audience, this may bother them, is last year I was doing an International Women's Day speech. And I was talking about ally versus accomplice. But one of the stories I tell in that is the story of how my wife almost died during childbirth. So I'm looking at different terminologies for people that give birth. And when I look at it, one of the things that came to mind as I'm talking to one of my mentors is that not everyone that gives birth is a woman. So I used the term birthing or pregnant individuals as a way to be more inclusive.
Yep.
And the thing with this is like, this is a show of how things are constantly changing and evolving. And there were a couple of people in the responses after the event that were like, I can't believe somebody was brought in and I'm being told that it's not just women that give birth. I'm like, okay. Well, who is that? You saying that, you believing that, are you doing that for your own comfort, or are you doing that because it's the reality of the situation? But again, this is just showing how we have to change and observe and learn time and time again, because being an accomplice, being a co-conspirator, as my dear friend, my family member, as my mentor, Future Kane, once said, what are you prepared for?
Right. And I think that is that notion of comfort or discomfort is the line that people seldom cross. They seldom cross as it relates to, moving from ally to accomplice or co-conspirator. And I will say, I want to just throw this out here, accomplice, co-conspirator, and things like that. In some circles, people try to look at that like it's a bad word. And it's like, we're not looking at the, oppression that people are facing as bad. Like, we're not looking at that. And so we go back to why we use the term, humanity, and why we're talking about it from a humanity standpoint, because the whole point of the need for accomplice, behaviors and co-conspirator is we have to counteract these pressures that are faced, whether you believe it or not. It's a reality for people. So.
And bringing this back to trust, because you've done a really good job of curbing everything I've said, because I lose sight of sort of what the main focus is going to be. At the end of the day, I think this all comes back to communication. We live in a society where we're not allowed to communicate properly, just straight up. I mean, how many times has somebody done something and then the first reaction is to go to HR?
Yep.
And it's because with so many legalities, with so much rules and so much structure, it creates an environment where you don't have to be an adult. And to me, being an adult is being able to listen, observe, learn, and not be offended when somebody tells you something that, like, hey, that really bothered me the way that you said that. That doesn't always mean that you're wrong. It just means that we need to observe and learn from our behavior. So, if I'm in a corporate environment, the best way for me to build trust is to say, listen, if you have an issue, if somebody says something that you like, it is okay to pause the conversation and say, hey, that really bothered me. And then have a back and forth conversation about why that happened and how it could be adjusted. Maybe it doesn't need to be adjusted. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding. People don't want to acknowledge. People shy away from the emotion that they're wrong. They don't like to be told that they hurt someone. So these cringe modalities are avoided at all costs.
Right.
Yet if we look at what the benefits are of truly having these conversations, even if you want to include HR in the conversation, although that makes everybody awkward, even if you want to include HR in the conversation, it's a lot more equitable and trust building to be able to have these conversations, understanding that there's not going to be necessarily the risk of job elimination or otherwise that you typically see with the way that people communicate. And one thing I'll give credit to is there are bosses out there that try to make this happen,
Yeah.
but when they're not supported by their bosses and their boss's boss, then they then put themselves at risk for creating what is then termed a hostile work environment, even though they're actually trying to do the opposite.
Yep. Yeah, totally agree. And I think another root of as we look at distrust in the organization is organizations seldom look at what they espouse and what they say, and then listen to the impact of the things that they do. Because again, we want to be comfortable. Again, we want to assume we want to assume everything we did was right. But like when people speak up, a lot of times in these systems, the ones that speak up get vilified for speaking up, for saying, what, this impacted me negatively, or this impacted this group negatively. You're now the villain. And so we have to do a better job at like not ostracizing those who are sharing the the marginalized perspective, I must say, or I guess the perspective that's not like normalized or what have you, because that takes a lot of courage, that takes a lot of faith, and I think that knee-jerk reaction to ostracize is a big issue in a lot of organizations.
I agree. And, everything's going back to this nature versus nurture thing. Being a parent of twin toddlers, I completely understand that when you tell somebody that they're doing something wrong and you see their reaction, you don't want to do that. Like you want to protect them at all costs. But going back to what you keep saying, and I think it's really sort of become the theme of this conversation, who is this actually benefiting?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, if I tell my child that they're doing something wrong, they may be upset, they may cry. They definitely will cry. But long term, if I help them understand why I was upset with their actions and that it's okay to be upset, and it's just as a matter of thinking about it and being conscious of it, then long term, it's doing two things. One is it's allowing them to be more well-rounded, but then it's also developing those communications, and that communication then leads to better mental health because they're not hiding in the corner, depressed, sad, when it happens at school, and ultimately holding it in. And it's this environment and culture of holding things in that is potentially the biggest issue that I see when I look at collectively everything that's happened. When people hold things in, the emotions that occur and the bubble bursting is very real. So it all starts with that trust building. But kids also know when you're pulling wool over their eyes. I'm not going to this is just hitting home for me right now because so I just went through an IEP meeting, individual education plan, for those that aren't familiar, for my daughter who has autism. And I met with their teacher, and I'm actually going to visit with their teacher because my daughter's starting on Monday. And I said, the one thing that you need to know about my family is that we don't abide by traditional gender roles or structures. So she goes, well, what do you mean by that? I said, well, a couple things. One is I take care of the kids. I clean. I do the laundry. I don't cook because I stink at it. But we are not teaching our kids that these are individual roles. Also, my kids are growing up learning the true history of America. They're reading books called the Anti-Racist Baby by, I believe his name is Xander Kendi. He's actually on LinkedIn. He wrote a series of books. Sorry, Ibram X Kendi, actually. The Anti-Racist Deck. So this is one of the things that he created to have conversation starters. My kids are learning about, the first book that they read was My Little Feminist. And I had to have that conversation
Mhm.
because I'm bringing my kids up so that if they hear inaccurate information in school about Christopher Columbus is a perfect
Mhm.
example,
Mhm.
they're going to know. And I have empowered them, and I am empowering them to say, well, no, wait a minute, and to
Mhm.
ask those questions. And they'll never get in trouble for asking those questions, even if the teacher pushes back.
Love it. I love it. We need more of that. So, how can people get to know you, reach you, connect with you? What would you share with folks?
So I'm in an interesting spot in the fact that I as we touched on, I'm going up on a year of unemployment after getting let go during the corporate layoffs last year. But because of that, I've been forced into having my own consulting firm.
Mhm.
So there's a couple of aspects that I'm looking at. Uh, the first and clearest is that if you want to get in touch with me, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I do have a website. Also, if you sign up for my mailing list, I'm not going to email you all the time, but it's in contact. I'm going to be starting some workshops. The first one is coming up either late this month or next month, and it's going to be on brand and platform strategy. So this is a high level course that I'm going to be talking about how I wound up uh, running a post that generated over 100,000 views every week for 2 years, and strategically how you could be smarter, not harder. Uh, you could also find me. I run a number of diversity events and contacts. I'm visible really all over the place. If you're interested in my consultancy, please reach out. I do long-term consultancy work because it's really ingrained in sustainable growth. So feel free to reach out. And I'm committing this year to doing more short form videos. So I talk a lot, as you know. So I'm trying to put out 1 to 2 short form videos per week. The last thing I would leave you with is, if you like and appreciate what I have to say, first of all, sign up for Dr. Sansbury's mailing list. But I would also encourage you to check out the stories that you didn't hear today, the Future Canes of the world, the Heliana Ramirez's of the world, uh, the Heidi Barkers, the Rosemary Campbell Stevens. Um, the sh- there's so many people that have stories, and I'm just one person that has a platform, but it's my honor to be able to utilize my platform to put others in positions of opportunity.
Well, thank you, Dan. As always, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate you coming on.
I appreciate being here anytime you want to have a conversation. I was actually really proud of myself because I didn't curse once. Uh, you know how I operate.
I do. I do. It's all good.
But yeah, it's been an honor and a privilege. And thank you. These are the passionate conversations that remind me who I am and what I do and why I do it.
Well, thank you. We'll talk later. Take care.
Absolutely. Bye.
All right. Bye bye. Love the conversation with Dan. Always a helpful person to talk to. I'm glad, glad I connected with Dan this time in the beginning of the year. Good to get my mindset right. Talking about trust. Like I said, coincidentally, we have some trust work I got to do this afternoon related to talking about mistrust in organizations, actually. And so this is a good conversation to start me off because I have a 2-hour session coming up. So if you like the show, please like, subscribe, leave comments. We're back this year. Got a lot of shows coming up. Last one for the week, I think, but we'll see you later. Thank you for listening to the Toxic Leadership Podcast. If you're on Spotify, Apple, iTunes, thank you for listening to Work on Wisdom as we sound off on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. I'm Dr. Kevin Sansbury, signing out.